The number that you like to quote the most, I think, post-1945, in terms of the history of warfare, is 0.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So at least since 1953, 0 wars between great powers. The Korean War was the last. 0 wars between Western European countries, which doesn't sound like a big deal until you remember that Western European countries started a new war at a rate of 2 a year for 600 years. After 1945, that went to 0. That's a big difference. 0 nuclear weapons have been used in battle since Nagasaki. Now, again, we kind of take that for granted now, but it wasn't so long ago that the experts were predicting that nuclear warfare was certain, just a matter of time when it was going to happen. And 0 wars between rich countries. Countries with the 45 countries with the highest GDP per capita have not fought a war. Again, the fact that it seems so obvious itself tells a story. We think, oh yeah, wars are things that happen in those primitive parts of the world. But it used to be the rich countries that were constantly at each other's throats, and rich countries can afford big armies with destructive weapons that do much more damage.
Immanuel Kant, Perpetual Peace, the essay. What lessons do you take from that?
So here was a German philosopher writing more than 200 years ago who threw out a number of hypotheses as to what could encourage peace. And this was not, brotherhood and sitting around a circle swaying back and forth or wearing peace signs. These were what he thought were practical measures that would remove the incentives of countries to fight wars, and therefore better than hoping that they'll just become more pacifist over time. So one of them was democracy. He predicted that as the world got more democratic, it would be less likely to wage wars, partly because if leaders are responsible to their citizens, they're less likely to get involved in stupid wars that bring glory to them, but it's the people who supply the cannon fodder. Another was trade, that if you had countries that traded with each other, each would have a selfish stake in the well-being of the other. That is, you want the market, you want the supply of goods. I mean, a modern example might be why I think it's unlikely that the United States and China will fight a war, even though there's not a whole lot of affection between the two countries. But they make too much of our stuff, and we owe them too much money. Going to war would be like going to war with ourselves, and we don't have to be particularly noble about it. It just would be a stupid thing to do.
Let's spend our remaining moments here on the rights revolution, because it really picked up steam, of course, after World War II. And I wonder, how much violence do you think there was actually left to curtail from that moment on?
Yes, I think Western societies have turned their sights on smaller and smaller categories of violence. That is, not on the scale of genocides and world wars, but still things that cause a great deal of human suffering. Spanking of children, the use of corporal punishment in schools like paddling and strapping. Domestic violence, not a trivial category of violence. Rape on the streets and in the home. Racial violence, like in the United States, lynchings and hate crimes of intimidation. Even cruelty to animals in labs and farms. All of these have become targets of moralistic denunciation campaigns, and they've often been successful. They're not just feel-good measures, but the rate of rape came down 80% since the 1970s when it was first measured. Domestic violence, way down. Victimization of children on the playground, down. Lynching was eliminated. There used to be 150 lynchings a year in the United States at the end of the 19th century. By 1950, that had gone down to 0.
I'm certainly inferring that the march you are describing is inexorable. But I wonder if that's true. I mean, there was the, Pax Romana a couple of thousand years ago, which, led to the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
Is it really inexorable, that which you're describing?
I don't think it's inexorable. I think it's, I think there are pressures in that direction, but it's not some mystical force that's going to carry us on its own accord. It depends on institutions that have to be in place. If the institutions collapse, then we could go right back.
The general intelligence of the population continuing to improve, presumably, is a huge foundation for what you're describing as well.
Yeah, hard as it is to believe, IQ scores went up throughout the 20th century, and by a lot, by about 3 points a decade. So that the population at the end of the 20th century was about 30 points higher than the population at the beginning. Not in all aspects of intelligence, but in abstract reasoning, similarities and analogies. And I went out on a limb and suggested that this was not unrelated to changes in attitudes. That if you really think about it, it's hard to justify putting homosexuals in prison. It's hard to justify racial segregation and the kinds of intimidation that helped enforce it. It's hard to say that there's nothing wrong with a husband raping his wife or beating up his wife. It's hard to argue that it's really okay to smack your children with weapons. And I think as issues get debated, as people think more abstractly, like how would I feel if I were in the place of that victim of violence, then people are going to rethink the way they run their lives, what's acceptable, what isn't. And I think that has been a force that's been behind the rights revolutions.
Do you have any prognostications about where you think we may be on this continuum 300 years from now?
I think violence against women is going to go down in much of the world. I think there's probably going to be more democracies. I don't think we're going to return to the Middle Ages in terms of rates of homicide or barbaric practices like breaking on the wheel. I think probably human trafficking will go down because all of them have been targets of reform campaigns, and in the past they have succeeded. However, terrorism, the 7 billion people, who knows what one fanatic might do. Yeah. Civil war, again, unpredictable. And if there's a collapse, a widespread collapse of a civilization, again, it could go back to the Middle Ages.
Should we still consider consumerism a strength, given the kinds of debts we're all carrying these days?
I think that's a great question, Steve. Our consumer society maxed out, especially in the United States, but also actually throughout the English-speaking world, on excess household debt. Now, Max Weber's concept of a work ethic was also a thrift ethic, and you can't really have a stable consumer society without saving. Mm-hmm. We decided we would experiment to see if we could have a zero savings rate in the United States and have households not only spend all that they earn, but go beyond that and actually borrow to increase the firepower. Well, we know how that ended, and it ended with one of the biggest financial crises of modern times. The 30 biggest shopping malls in the world today, only 3 of them are in the United States. The rest are in emerging markets. I don't think the consumer society lives here anymore. I think it's in its death throes in that excessively leveraged English-speaking world.
One quote from your book here: "Civilizations are complex things. For centuries they can flourish in a sweet spot of power and prosperity, but then, often, quite suddenly, they can tip over the edge into chaos." Let's finish up on this. Are you worried about the future of Western civilization?
Yes, I am, and I'm worried that we complacently assume we should be worrying about decline, which is a kind of gradual sounding thing. Maybe our problems will get serious in 2050, but let's leave that for Junior to worry about. That is not how things work in history. I was really struck as I was writing the book by the number of collapses I encountered, all the way back from ancient Rome, which fell apart really quickly in the 5th century, through the Aztecs and the Incas, looking at what went wrong with imperial Spain, looking at the way the Ming Empire fell apart, and then the Qing dynasty after that. And what occurred to me was that things happen really fast. Collapse rather than decline is what you need to worry about. And when one watches what's happening in Europe today, the speed with which the project of European integration is unraveling, I think there's a warning there for North America. Excessively indebted public sectors can implode in ways that right now most of us appear not to expect.
Are we just not paying enough care and attention to the institutions that have got us to where we are today?
Yeah, I think that is the problem. I mean, for example, if you look at the quality of public education in the US, high schools are really poor compared with their Asian competitors. They do not get people to an adequate standard of numeracy when they leave high school. Or look at the rule of law. That used to be really good in the English-speaking world. Now it's a nightmare. In fact, ask anybody trying to do business in the United States, what is your biggest headache? The answer is not, in fact, government. The answer is the lawyers and the compliance department, and all the kind of hidden burdens that are imposed by an excessively litigious and over-regulated system. So we have a lot of institutional problems right now, and I think these are there on both sides of the Atlantic, so they're Western phenomena generally. And we're not addressing them. In fact, we're often arguing about completely the wrong things. I'm absolutely sure there's a problem of inequality in Western societies right now, but we're misdiagnosing it. We're not recognizing that one reason that the bottom 20% of the population is getting poorer is globalization and the competition that we are now encountering from countries like China.
Having said that, they want to be like us. They still do. And they want in on our institutions. And they're creating some of their own to mirror what we've got. So do we really need to be that fearful that we're going to be overcome? It sounds like they want to be part of the game with us.
Up to a point. Remember, the Chinese economy will probably overtake that of the US within 5 years to become the biggest in the world. And China has downloaded most of the killer apps, but not all of them. China does not want a system based on private property rights and representative government. It doesn't really want the rule of law as we understand it. And it certainly doesn't want freedom as we understand it. So anybody who wants to sit back complacently and say, why should we worry, they're becoming like us, hasn't spent enough time in China. This is a kind of partial download of Western institutions. It's Asian fusion that we're seeing here, not pure Westernization. And a world in which China is the number one power will be a lot less congenial and comfortable than a world in which the United States was the number one power. People underestimate that at their peril.
Can you imagine a day and age when we become such an empathic civilization that we just can't kill each other in wars like that anymore?
I can imagine that for sure. Let me say that the reason we have such a bad idea about the human race, and not to cast aspersion to our historians, but if you take a look, if you're a student of history, of history books, they're terrible. They're all about war, conquest, exploitation, empires, redress of grievances. Now, why is that what we talk about in history books?
Because it's dramatic and it sells books.
Well, absolutely. And it's extraordinary because these events, genocide, blowbacks, exploitation, they're extraordinary. They don't happen every moment. So they get our attention. They trigger flight, fright. And then they become newsworthy. We do this on TV. But then we chronicle them as if this is our history uninterrupted. And it gives us a pretty bad picture of the history of the human race. We would have probably perished a long time ago if that was our nature. I remember a quote by George Frederick Hegel. I read it 30, 40 years ago. And he said, happiness are the blank pages of history. They're the periods of harmony. And what he was suggesting is there's another history. The Empathic Civilization, this book I wrote, I went back and tried to rethink history from a completely different interpretation. What we find, there is another history. It seems ordinary, and we don't talk about it, but there's a history of the evolution of empathy of the human race. It's there, it's incontrovertible. I couldn't use historians to tell the story, so I went back and I looked at narrative. From the first written story at Gilgamesh, through the great Greek tragedies, the romances, the novel in the modern age.
You think it goes back that far?
Oh, absolutely. And what you find is if you're in a primitive forager-hunter society, there's empathic distress, but not mature empathy, because there's no sense of selfhood. There's no sense that I'm an I and you're a you. It's a collective we. So empathy extends to blood ties, and it's mainly empathic distress, but it isn't mature empathy. When you go to the great hydraulic agricultural civilizations and create theological consciousness, all the great religions form. What happens? Empathy extends from blood ties to a new fiction, religious families. So now every Jew thinks of every other Jew as family. It's fictional, not blood, and they empathize. Every Christian empathizes with their brother and sister Christians, Muslims with Muslims. By the time you get to the Industrial Revolution, with the market economy and nation state, you have this new fiction, national governments. All of a sudden, Germans think of other Germans as Germans. It's a fiction. They empathize with Germans, but maybe not Italians. Italians think of Italians as family and empathize, but maybe not with the French. But again, empathy extends one more time, from blood ties to religious ties, now to national identity. So the question I'm asking in the book, why isn't it possible now that we extend the boundaries from blood ties, religious ties, and national ties, and start thinking of the human race as a family, start thinking as the biosphere as our community, our fellow creatures as our evolutionary family? Why is that a big stretch? Why would we only stop with tribal blood ties, religious association, and national identity?
Who's doing that? Who's thinking that way?
Well, I think Homo empathicus is emerging across the sciences. I think the European Union is a little ahead of the game because it's the first, and reason is so much bloodshed in that continent. That's the bloodiest continent in the world. And after thousands of years, and after World War II and the Holocaust, they said, we're done. We're taking the blood, we're taking it off our hands. We're going to learn how to live together.
You still had the Balkans in the 90s. And
you still did. It was the last remnants. But now there are 500 million people across 27 states that were at war for thousands of years living in peace, open borders.
Financially in trouble, but...
Well, so the whole world's financially in trouble. I remind our friends that the EU is still the lead economy in the world, and the GDP of their 27 states exceeds the GDP of my 50 states, and if you put China and the US together, it's almost matched by the entire wealth of the EU. It's just they're not a military power. But the European Union, among the younger generation, the sensibility is that we build bridges of peace. They don't have a big military machine. We learn how to extend our cultural diversity so we think as a family. There are a lot of problems. There's a lot of xenophobia and throwback, but at least in principle, they're there. They believe in not just growth, but sustainable development. They championed the climate change treaty.
So they're the model, you think?
I think they are. I think what we're going to start to see as we move to a third industrial revolution, where we share energy across entire continents, we're going to see continental political frames of reference. They're going to be networks, not hierarchies. So we'll have the localities, the regions, the nations, and then because these energies have to be distributed across continents, we're going to see the world boil down to 5 continental unions: the African Union, the Asian Union, European Union, the American unions. And we will begin to create, I hope, biosphere consciousness. I hope we can do it in time.
Up next, for all the hopefulness expressed by Jeremy Rifkin, the author of The Empathic Civilization, his last words suggest that the amount of time we have to create a more collaborative civilization is limited. Perhaps not everyone will agree that we are running out of time, but most will agree that change occurs much faster than it ever did in the past. Andrew McAfee, co-author of Race Against the Machine, used the story about the inventor of chess to illustrate the pace of change today.
It's a legend about the inventor of the game of chess, who took his invention to the Emperor of India, showed him the game of chess, and the Emperor was so delighted by the invention that he said, "Wow, you can name your own reward." The inventor was a really clever guy, and he said, "Your Majesty, all I want is a pile of rice. And we're going to calculate the size of the pile of rice by putting 1 grain of rice on the first square of my chessboard. We're going to double that. We're going to put 2 grains of rice on the second square of the chessboard. Double that, double that." Now, the inventor obviously knew a bit more math than the emperor did, because the emperor thought that he was asking for too small a reward. So he granted it just in an offhand way. And then if you do these doublings, if you do 63 of these doublings, you wind up with a pile of rice that's the size of Mount Everest. So in some versions of the legend, the emperor, once he realizes that he's been had, he beheads the inventor because he's so upset at being fooled. The point of telling the story, though, is not just to demonstrate the power of constant doubling. And we know that computers double in power and capability about every 18 months. That's Moore's law. It's held true basically for the entire computer age. The reason to tell that story, where we thought things got really interesting, was in the second half of the chessboard. Because Ray Kurzweil, who's an inventor and a futurist, makes a really interesting observation. He says, after 32 doublings, in the first half of the chessboard, once you're halfway through, you only have a pile of rice that's the equivalent of about what you'd get out of 1 big field. In other words, the emperor is not in danger of losing his entire kingdom worth of riches, and the inventor is not in danger of losing his head. It's only when you get into the second half of the chessboard that this constant doubling really starts to overwhelm all of your intuition, all of your preconceptions, and starts to yield piles of rice the size of Mount Everest. So we thought that was really interesting. We did a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation. The United States started tracking something called information technology as an investment category in 1958. If you take 18 months as that doubling period, and that's the most common one with Moore's law, you add 32 times 18 months to that, that takes you up to about 2006. So by that really trivial calculation, we entered the second half of the chessboard when it comes to computers somewhere around the middle of the last decade. And that helps explain to me why we see things like the Jeopardy playing supercomputer and Siri and the Google car and all these weird science fiction kinds of technologies appearing just in the past few years. Now, if that story has any validity to it, there's one conclusion, and that is we ain't seen nothing yet, because the doubling is going to continue, and the accumulation of technological prowess and knowledge and capability is only going to continue. So we're going to keep getting blown away by the digital advances of the future.
Is it not conventional wisdom in our society that we expect that whatever jobs we lose because of new technology, they're going to be replaced by new jobs? And is that true?
Yeah, that has been conventional wisdom, and it has been remarkably true for at least the past 200 years. The Luddites started smashing looms in England just about 200 years ago because they were afraid for their jobs, and they did lose their jobs, but they found other jobs. And the entire history of technical progress has been one of creative destruction. Technology destroys some kinds of jobs and some kinds of job categories, but it creates entirely new ones. That's still going on. The important thing to keep in mind is that there is no economic law that says that those two always have to be in balance, and that the pace of creation has to match the pace of destruction. That's not written anywhere. So the main thing that I'm concerned about now is that we are destroying the destruction side of that equation is more pronounced than the creation side. Both are absolutely still going on, and I sit here in San Francisco, kind of in the epicenter of the technology revolution. There's a huge amount of creation going on, new companies, new jobs being formed, but these industries are not making a huge dent in the big base of unemployment that we have. I'll give you one quick statistics. Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google combined are extraordinarily valuable, influential, really, really powerful companies. They combine to employ fewer than 125,000 people. That is less than the number of people who enter the American workforce every month.
How far around the corner is a world where the machines are smarter than we are?
Well, I think there's, again, going back to this idea of multiple dimensions of intelligence, which we know exist in humans. So you can't answer that in general. You can take any particular area of intelligence or any dimension, and you can start asking that more specifically. So in many areas, machines are better than humans. Chess, for example, which we touched on earlier, machines are better than humans. Is that a world-changing event? I don't think so.
And Michael, as we look to that world where we cross the singularity threshold, there's no guarantee, obviously, that that's going to be a world that will be friendly to humans, right?
No, and it's not. And, part of that reason is that we have all these purpose-built machines that are designed to do very specific things that you were talking about. The robots are not adaptable the way we are. So it depends on the intention of the maker. If you want a machine that's going to go out and kill people, you'll get a machine that does that. And there's a lot of money going into that research. If you want a machine that will patch people up who have medical problems or have trauma, extreme physical trauma, we'll get that. And if you want a car that you just get into and you say, please drive me to so-and-so's house, then you'll get that. And you'll have all these very purpose-built machines that, will they converge into one general purpose machine that acts like a human being? I don't know. And that's where we are.
We've been talking so far about replicating humans, some. The future may also not just be limited to that, it may also include us becoming them. Cyborgs. Let's bring up the results of this 2009 poll by Zogby International. People were surveyed and asked, do you want to be a cyborg? Would you want to have the internet wired directly into your brain? Only 13% of the people at this point say yes, 82% say no. Next question. Would you agree to have a computer chip implanted in your brain if it would make you immune to disease? A quarter of those surveyed said yes, a little over half said no, still almost a quarter aren't sure about that one. Couple of more. Would you agree to have a computer chip implanted in your brain if it would provide you a storehouse of knowledge? Again, about a quarter saying yes, 58% no, about a fifth not sure. And one more. Would you agree to have a computer chip implanted in your brain which would provide you with entertainment? And on this one, only 6% say yes, 86% say no, 9% not sure. Now, let me just turn around here and talk to our audience for a second. Stand by, guys. Let's do a little survey of the room here. Michael, a wide shot if you would. There we go. How many of you would agree to have a chip implanted in your brain if it would enable you to do any of those things we just talked about? Provide you more knowledge, provide you with entertainment, avoid having certain diseases? Hands up, please. Who would go for that? In this room, it looks like about half. Okay, hands down. How many people say no? Okay, a little more than half. You are
You are not representative of Zogby's universe. This is a very hip sciencey crowd tonight. Okay, we have a long way to go, obviously, as these figures indicate, before people are willing to merge with machines. Are you surprised to see this?
I'm not. I mean, one of the early, I keep going back to DARPA, the subject of my book, because DARPA has funded a lot of this research. The guy who created the computer mouse, Douglas Engelbart, a DARPA researcher, had this vision of man-machine symbiosis, and that was back in the early 60s, early to mid-60s. His vision was that machines would not only become more capable of interacting with us, but we would become more capable of interacting with them. So we'd end up with something that met in the middle. We would evolve and the machines would evolve, and we'd meet in the middle. And as we see today, that really doesn't happen. People are constantly pushing computers to behave more like them so they don't have to go meet the computer halfway.
Hud?
Well, I think, you know, first of all, many people are already hooked up to a computer a couple of hours a day.
How do you mean?
Through iPod, checking email, whatever. They're essentially, a lot of these questions are already there. Now, what I think is more interesting than just these numbers is the trends over the years. I'm sure if you did that survey 5 years ago, the numbers would be much lower, and I'm sure if you do it again in 5 years, they'll be much higher. So I think there's a trend. People are getting accustomed to these ideas, the advantages, the disadvantages, feeling more comfortable with technology. And so I think these numbers will just keep on going higher, and it will happen.
Corey.
So what I was surprised by in this survey is just how 1980s it was, because it asked a bunch of questions about what you would do with a chip in your brain, and they were all about having access to content, right? A storehouse of knowledge, entertainment material, and so on. And none of it asked what you would do if you had an internet chip that let you communicate with everyone else, essentially to become telepathic. But you know, the telecoms industry is 100 times larger than the entertainment industry, because conversation is king, content isn't. Content's just what we talk about. So I was really struck by this. This was a very 80s futuristic view when we thought that the internet would be about delivering 500 channels of high-definition television, not about delivering 6 billion human beings at the click of a mouse. I also wonder what would happen if you asked the same question of people who had incipient Alzheimer's. That you know, maybe when you've got a lot to lose, you might not take the risk, but if you came up to someone and said, well, you know, you probably will be delusional in 5 years, would you have a chip now that might extend that by 10, 15, or 20? I think
you might go for.
You get a very different answer.
Yeah, I bet you're right.
Up next, if you're comfortable with the idea of having our bodies fused with computer chips, there are plenty more of you who will see it as a sign the apocalypse is upon us. Perhaps that explains why apocalyptic ideas are popular, that films depicting the end of the world as we know it have become part of our culture. Here's an excerpt from a recent agenda debate on why so many are attracted to apocalyptic visions.
Discovery Channel in 2009 did something on their anticipation of the apocalypse in 2012, this year. Let's watch. Roll tape, please.
December 21st, 2012. Fire pours down from the sky. Oceans leap up and swallow the land. Continents rip themselves apart.
Doomsayers believe on the 21st of December 2012, we can expect billions of people to die. It's going to be a very, very bad day for planet Earth.
Vivian Rakoff, you've got a thought as to why people today in our modern society are looking to texts of many hundreds or thousands of years ago to explain why the world's going to end this year?
Well, I think people in our modern society are exactly the same as people have always been. And I would defer to the other members of the panel in detail, but there are repetitive stories of apocalyptic expectation, carrying with them, as was, I think, very properly pointed out, the notion of rebirth. There is always, the world is always imperfect. The world is always changing. You know, the intense dialectic of going onward and outward and having opposition never changes. Every day sees the death of a life. We go to sleep. Every human being anticipates the end of their own existence. So the sense of things coming to an end is with us all the time. The notion that modern human beings are somehow different from human beings in previous times, or indeed in different cultures, is that these people are very different, is I think a peculiarly provincial one, in the sense that we believe that our time is specifically different. I don't believe that.
None of these theories of doomsday and apocalyptic ending would be quite as credible, or might be listened to, if we didn't in fact have some real and serious things to worry about on that score. I mean, in the newsrooms of the world, there's a file somewhere that said, meteor may be approaching Earth, then what, Earth gets 9 months to prepare for it. Or terrorists get hold of the great germ that can wipe out half of humanity. Or there is a superbug that wipes out giant elements of the human population, like the Spanish flu in 1919. These are not utterly improbable events that one day may face us. So we do live in a world where, in actual fact, doomsday is always possible to some degree.
Good point, Vivian Rakoff?
Yes, and again, there is a perennial quality here. You know, if you were in a small village on the Turco-Hungarian plain and Genghis Khan was coming, that was the atomic bomb. When the Vikings came up the estuary and burned your village and took everybody away, that was also an atomic bomb. There have always been, for particular worlds, to pick up, I think, Robert's very important word, an eschatological ending. But that's very different from the kind of end of the world that is even predicted in this Mayan calendar, or which carries with it the notion of the apocalyptic. And I'm entirely in agreement with Robert, because, you know, we have Sodom, but Abram and his kids get away. We have the Great Flood, which is also in Mesopotamian legend, is in Gilgamesh, you know. But Noah and his boys and his wife, they get away. And those are the most ancient, but these things are repetitive. Norman Cohn, in his extraordinary book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, examines these cults of apocalyptic destruction in the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance period very carefully. They always carry with them that primary dichotomy, which Robert referred to. We will cleanse the world, and then what happens afterwards will be good. It is, and you'll monitor me if I go on for too long, but it's in the notions of the anarchist, and I mean in the most serious sense, anarchist thinkers, Kropotkin, Bakunin, that what you have to do is destroy the terrible world that is, and what will come later will be good. And it might even be a thread, and I say no more than a thread, in the Occupy movement, which is castigated for having no program. But the point of that occupation is, yes, we have no program, because what is so lousy. We want it to disappear, and out of that will come a new, kind, interdependent, democratic, wonderful world.
More just. If you were in the time of Genghis Khan, it may as well have been that you thought the apocalypse was upon you when you saw him coming over the hills. But the reality is, the world wasn't connected then the way it is today. It can happen halfway around the world today, and you'll know about it wherever in the world you are. Does that enhance the sense of apocalypse that we all live with on a day-to-day basis?
Probably, yeah. This sense of interconnection, and also just the greater knowledge that we have of the state of the earth itself. So somebody whose village was destroyed by whichever horde of whichever time, and of course this is a perennial fact of human existence, war and famine and pestilence, all of these different things, all the horsemen, if you like, have made regular appearances. But people haven't been burdened with the greater knowledge of what happens everywhere. They haven't been able to step off of Earth itself, look back at it, and have this image of Earth as something fragile, something that is itself under cosmic threat, not just threat from the next village over or from some expanding empire or from some kind of pestilence. And so I think it's added to our degree of existential angst that we just have this increased knowledge. And indeed, as Brian was saying, we've got this knowledge of war zones and disaster zones the world over, and we can watch it unfold in real time on television. And that is new. And we have to find ways to assimilate that into our current consciousness. So if you add all of those things on top of a traditional substrate that always says, disaster is coming, disaster is coming, it's the natural order of things that disaster is coming, then of course it's going to weigh heavily upon us.
And I'm going to infer from that answer as well, Catherine, that the more we explore space, the more we're inviting ourselves to continue this. Is that right?
Well, it doesn't have to be that way, but it seems to be shaping up that way. The truth is that space is dangerous. It's not particularly hospitable to people. I mean, there is no other world at this time that we can comfortably live upon. There are always hopes of terraforming, of living in environmental bubbles, et cetera, et cetera. But at the moment, it's dangerous. And we're also more aware than ever before that, yes, meteorites do impact the Earth, and yes, these things have consequences. So part of the space exploration is understanding the context of Earth within the vast sweep of cosmic time. And if we actually look at the Earth's history, we see so many ways in which it's been under threat, so many mass extinctions. And so that's another kind of knowledge that we've had to try to assimilate into our present modern mentality, and it's not easy to do.
We are going to talk about optimism, about the future, but first of all, we want to start with this. Surviving Progress is a 2004 documentary based on the Massey lecture by writer Ronald Wright, and he's going to get us kicked off here with a bit of a discussion of the other side of the coin. So here's a little excerpt from Surviving Progress, and we'll come back and talk. Michael, tape please.
In defining progress, I think it's very important to make a distinction between good progress and bad progress. I mean, things progress in the sense that they change. Both in nature and in human society, there appears to be a clear trend towards increasing complexity as change proceeds. We tend to delude ourselves that these changes always result in improvements from the human point of view. We're now reaching a point at which technological progress and the increase in our economies and our numbers threaten the very existence of humanity.
Okay, small clarification, lecture 2004, documentary just out recently. Robert, start us off here. Why do so many people these days seem to see the future so apprehensively?
Well, we live in a very changeable time. Lots of things are changing, and change is something to be frightened of. And people have very short memories. In the nice clip there, we heard that we're reaching a point where progress threatens humanity. We reached that point in 1945 when we invented atomic weapons. What's amazing is in all the time since, except that one time, we have never used them on people. Never, never. The United States and the Soviet Union stood down from the verge of destroying each other. So although it's always in vogue to say we're at the precipice, we're about to fall over, it's about to come to an end, in fact, the history of the second half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st is one of increasing prosperity and peace around the world.
That is true, but James, let me bring you in to ask you this. No nuclear weapons have not been used since Nagasaki in 1945, but everybody you talk to in the national security establishment of your country fears that some kind of nuclear suitcase bomb is going to go off in Times Square tomorrow. Why do we consistently see that as the potential view of the future?
Well, I would go back to reasons to be optimistic. First, the work that Steven Pinker has recently done that helps to document the fact that fewer people over the last millennia, fewer and fewer people die violent deaths. And even with the threat of weapons of mass destruction in the 20th and now 21st century, that continues to be the case, that fewer and fewer people die in wars and conflicts. But there are, of course, weapons of mass destruction out there and potential weapons of mass destruction which could wreak mega deaths on the Earth. And I think it's right to be afraid of them and right to have proactive policies. Of course, the average person has no idea how to assess the relative risks of eating a hamburger versus nuclear terrorism, and they should be far more concerned about saturated fats than they should about nuclear terrorism. But that's the nature of the human mind at this point.
The fact is, Steven Pinker's work notwithstanding, and he was in that chair a month ago in the studio talking to us about it,
we still have an irrational fear of the future. How come?
Well, and I think the hamburger example shows that the threats are still in great abundance. They may not be as great and spectacular as nuclear war, but there is a real feeling that there's danger around the corner. And I think where technology legitimately gives people hope, it's politics and economics that are the source of despair. And people don't feel positive about their economic prospects, and they don't feel empowered. They don't feel in control of their lives and their agency, and nor do they have the trust in elected officials to get them out of the mess they're in terms of rising cynicism.
But that's not all of life, though. All of life is not politics and economics. There's everything else.
But I think what's changed is technology has failed to deliver on that hope. That for a long time, you know, if you want to go back to the Cold War, technology was central to that notion of progress, that notion of delivering us something better, and it hasn't. And I think as younger generations wake up to their parents telling them, look, that bachelor's degree ain't going to cut it. You have to do a lot more if you want to improve the standing of this family. It's that political economy that I think is fueling the depression because technology doesn't deliver the hope.
Let me invite one more voice into this discussion, at least for a few seconds anyway. You all know William Gibson, the sci-fi writer who lives out in Vancouver. Here's what he's got to say about the future. Michael, roll tape, please.
As a society, I think we've actually come to a parting of the ways with the capital F future. And when I was a kid, the future almost always had a capital F. Everything in it was new and future-y, and it was unconsciously assumed to have no past content.
And better, too, I presume.
Yeah, and everything was better. That's a very North American way of looking at it. The Europeans, who have always had to live, in effect, in their own retrofitted ruins, never really had that. I think they envied us that ability to see the future as all new, all better.
William Gibson in this studio a little over a year ago. So, Madeline, where do you stand on the future with a capital F?
A couple of years ago, I was at a convention where the keynote speakers were Charles Stross, a science fiction writer, and Paul Krugman, the New York Times economist,
Nobel Prize-winning Princeton
yes,
University.
Exactly. So it was pretty amazing to be in that room. And one of the things that Krugman complained about was that when he was a little boy, there was this capital F future. And one of the things that he said was, you know, in the past 50 years, from when I was a little boy to now, the American kitchen has not changed.
What?
He said the American kitchen has not changed. When I was a little boy, we were supposed to be getting to our kitchen in jetpacks, presumably, and the kitchen was supposed to be different, and robots were supposed to be handling it, and it was supposed to be self-cleaning, and it was going to look much better and be far different. And nothing has changed between then and now. And I leaned over to my friend and I said, a lot has changed, actually. There's a man in there now.
Yes.
And you know, and not only is there a man in there now, but there could be two men in there now, and they could be married, and they could adopt a child, and moreover, their refrigerator could be solar powered, and moreover, they could have a refrigerator full of ingredients that are all imported from all over the world, and they could know how to pronounce them.
So the future with a capital F looks good to you then?
But that is not the future with a capital F. That is the sort of ahistorical perfect future, what Mr. Gibson would call the Gernsback continuum. That is, you know, the future that we get to perfectly define, and it is not a globalized future. You know, the Jetsons' future was not necessarily globalized at all. The future that we have is the future that is, you know, the one that we all get to participate. It's a participatory future that is informed by a variety of different sources that we never had access to before. It was easy to you know, look for those threats, you know, to look at the communist threat, to look at other different threats and villainize and so on, when we had only a limited source of information, when we didn't have an always on, always diverse feed from everywhere and from different voices, from voices that we never got to hear from before.
Robert.
When Bill Gibson talks about the future with a capital F. It was the consensus future that we all thought was coming. There was one vision, started in some measures you mentioned. Hugo Gernsback, the science fiction writer, the 1939 New York World's Fair vision of the future, the Jetsons vision of the future. And
does everybody get the reference to the Jetsons? It just occurred to me that if you're Jesse's age, you might
Hanna-Barbera cartoon series, the opposite of the Flintstones, the modern future family instead of the modern Stone Age family.
Exactly.
And we all thought that's what we were going to get. Hyper-automation, pill food, robot helpers in the household, flying cars. That was the Jetsons' future. We've seen in the last couple of weeks, actually, in the run-up to the American choosing a Republican candidate, how fractured the views of the future are going to be. Newt Gingrich has come out and talked about colonies on the moon, and it's become risible.
He's become ridiculed for doing it.
He's ridiculed because he has not deviated from the consensual future that we all had 20 or 30 years ago. And now everybody's, are you crazy? Now, I happen to think it would be nice to go to the moon again, but I can't push it over top of any of a long list of other things that we should be doing.
Exactly.
Gingrich still believes in the future that Bill Gibson referred to. The rest of us are saying, wait a minute, let's have a discussion about which future we really do want to make it reality.
Can I get James's view on that?
But the Chinese...
Yeah, James, let me just put a question to you as you follow up here, because Gingrich, what he said, for those who missed it, was, by the end of my second term, he said, I would like there to be a colony that the Americans run, flying the Stars and Stripes, on the moon. And he seemed to think that it was possible to have, I think at that point, 10 or 15,000 people living up there. That's 9 years from now. He has been widely ridiculed. Should he have been?
Well, he should be widely ridiculed because he's vile and easily dismissible. But the
now,
Chinese...
Get off the fence there, James. Tell me what you really think.
The Chinese have been talking about putting a base on the moon for a long time, and I think that they are actually moving towards that project. They're not laughing at this prospect at all. I don't think we should either. I think there should be a more aggressive space program, both for the moon and Mars. And of course, the previous presidents have committed to that, but done nothing in terms of the funding. And even Gingrich's budget proposal was to cut NASA and try to encourage the private sector to go to the moon.
But he's not crazy to want to go to the moon, though.
It's not crazy. I think space is integral to a vision of the human future. The notion that we would forever be confined to this planet, this gravity well, is a very limited vision.
Okay, let me read this from The Economist magazine. This was published a couple of years ago, a few years ago now. And Jesse, come out of this with a question for you. In the rich world, the idea of progress has become impoverished. Through complacency and bitter experience, the scope of progress has narrowed. The popular view is that although technology and GDP advance, morals and society are treading water, or depending on your choice of newspaper, sinking back into decadence and barbarism. On the left of politics these days, progress comes with a pair of ironic quotation marks attached. On the right, progressive is a term of abuse. Do you agree that that future progress has got to be better than things are now, not just more than things are now?
I think that's the project of Western society, yes. And if we regard ourselves as having a commitment to those beyond our family, to society as a whole, yes. But I think the issue that Robert kind of touched upon is that the consensus of the future is gone. And because we can't build that agreement, I think that's why we can't agree what progress is or what advancement should be so that it's universal and not imperial, to use a juxtaposition.
Well, we know what we don't want, right?
But I think the problem is the present, that we're not all in the same present. I've spent my whole life being dismissed by other people who said that I was from the future, that my understanding of the internet was so ahead of theirs that they didn't have to take it seriously because it didn't apply to their present. And I often find that the way people describe the internet is as a procrastination. Well, that's the future. I don't have to learn about it today. I can still use my telephone and use my pieces of paper and do all the things I do today. So what I see is an entrenchment of the status quo. And that power, which is becoming increasingly illegitimate because of how transparent wealth inequality is, that they're finding ways to further entrench the status quo. And one way is to rob us of the future.
And they're all boomers, no doubt, right?
No, not at all.
No?
I think boomers are our allies because boomers were the first generation to turn their nose at tradition and say, we with the electronic media can recreate ourselves And then my generation said, yeah, and said, copyright gone. And let us find an even greater way to reinvent ourselves. And the response is the Stop Online Piracy Act, where power tries to stop it.
Come on in, James.
Well, I think part of the struggle that we're having around the term progress, or the concept of progress, goes back to 300 years of Enlightenment thought that the idea of inevitability of progress was one of the core tenets of the Enlightenment, but another of the core tenets was ruthless use of reason and the tearing away of unsupportable myths. And one of those myths turned out to be the myth of progress, and when you tore it away, you found that it was often being used to rationalize things like imperialism and exploitation. That's all perfectly correct, and we have to open ourselves to the possibility that the future is radically unpredictable and a mix of positive and negative trends that could lead to chaos or utopia. And so any kind of faith in the inevitability of progress is misplaced. But at the same time, what we often see is a kind of counter-Enlightenment trend of people who take the opposite lesson and say that we have to have a faith that we're screwing it up, and that Mother Nature is punishing us, and that we have hubris that we need to be punished for, and that also has to be guarded against. Well, I am a transhumanist, former director of the World Transhumanist Association, as a matter of fact. And I think part of the question here is whether we will identify with and see as successors the non-organic life forms that come in the future, robots or uploaded humans or whatever they might be. Very few of us would want to live lives constrained by the values of our Paleolithic ancestors. Whatever gods they worshipped or whatever values they had are completely irrelevant to us now. And so the notion that there will be future generations of sentient beings who are our descendants, who are the products of our work and our labor, who are radically different from us and who we can't currently identify with, I think is inevitable and something that's probably welcome. But it's not necessarily progress, because progress is in the eye of the beholder, but it is inevitable.
With just a few minutes left here, let me put one more idea on the table for your analysis. Which statement is more accurate? The future, we can shape it in the way that we want to, or the future is out there, but technology will have its way with us regardless? Robin.
Oh, the former. The future is ours to make. We are, he talked about our Paleolithic ancestors, we are tool-making creatures who have always been the masters of our tools. We will continue to be the masters of our tools. The robot is simply the descendant of the chert nodule that has been napped into something useful. We will make a bright, sunny tomorrow because that is in our dispositions to make that. It has been what we've been working towards. We're in a continuum that is nowhere near its end. And I think very much we have the ability to choose what tomorrow is going to be.
See,
Jesse?
I think that's fiction, because I think that while I agree with the sentiment that the future is there for us to shape it, the prerequisite is our understanding of the present. And at that, we are clueless. Until we understand, this is Ursula Franklin, until we understand where we are, we cannot know where we want to go. And where we have within us the power to go where we want to go, we cannot get there until we talk honestly about where we are.
And yet the Steven Pinker that you suggested, Better Angels of Our Nature, is a international bestseller. The fact is these things are on the table and are part of public discourse.
Madeline, we can shape the future, or the technology will shape us?
We build our technology to satisfy our own desires. And then that technology provides us with the ability to satisfy desires we didn't know we had.
I agree that humans and technology have been co-evolving since flint-knapped tools and fire, and that we will continue to co-evolve into whatever we become next. I think one of the critical questions that we face is the development of new forms of governance, especially at the global level, which allow us to get a hand through democratic participation on some of the technological threats, existential, catastrophic threats that technology may pose for the future. We definitely do need to develop that kind of direct democratic participation.
Interesting. What a great discussion about the future. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.